Hello there, and welcome to this week's installment on how we can make Destiny 2 better for the players. This will be the last video in this little mini-series on how the light-based subclasses can be brought into the modern day. In this video, I'm going to explain how I would revamp the game's Void subclasses. We're going to discuss how Void as an element can be reworked to have unique elemental effects like Stasis, and we will then discuss how Titan, Hunter, and Warlock Void subclasses can be redesigned with customizable aspects and fragments. Let's jump in. So, let's jump right in and discuss how Void as an element can be reworked to have unique elemental effects like Stasis. As I mentioned in my other subclass rework videos, the biggest issue with the light subclasses today is that instead of feeling like different unique elements, our light powers are instead a single, streamlined space magic with orange, blue, and purple color palettes. Bungie has committed Destiny 2 to incorporate and embrace more RPG elements, and giving Void, Solar, and Arc individual identities and effects on the battlefield would go a long way towards that goal. Now, before we talk about the specifics of Void's elemental properties, there is another functionality that I want to incorporate not just to the Void element, but to all elements in the game. I explain this premise in much more detail in my video about updating the game's Solar subclasses, but I believe that Stasis and the two upcoming Darkness subclasses in Witch Queen and Lightfall are likely to be dark mirrors of our current light subclasses. What I'm proposing is that each pair of light and dark subclass elements should prime targets to take more damage from the other. I view this as a more permanent form of the artifact mod focusing lens, and I think that this would do wonders to making the game into more of an RPG. So, with that caveat out of the way, how can we make Void into a unique gameplay element? I think that each element in the game should have a trio of unique effects similar to the slow, freeze, and shatter paradigm that Stasis is based around. In my last two videos, I proposed the trio of Ignite, Burn, and Explode for Solar, as well as the trio of Shock, Disrupt, and Discharge for Arc. For Void, I propose yet another new trio of unique elemental effects: Negate, Suppress, and Consume. My goal with Negate, Suppress, and Consume is to elevate Void to the power level of Stasis in PvE, give Void subclasses meaningful customization choices, and to not ruin the game in PvP like Stasis has been doing since Beyond Light's launch. First up, let's discuss the Negate debuff. The Negate debuff would be a simple on or off status effect with no stacking system. When a target is affected by Negate, they would be weakened and take 20% more damage. Think of this as a more permanent version of the old artifact mod Oppressive Darkness. When you defeat a negated target, they will emit a small, non-damaging blast of suppressing Void energy. Think of this as the subclass version of the Warmind Cell mod Cellular Suppression. And finally, Negate would last for 3 seconds by default, and this timer resets each time the target takes damage from a negating source. Now, let's talk about the Suppress effect. The Suppress debuff would temporarily suppress all abilities and make them unavailable for use. Defeating a suppressed target will trigger the Consume effect for all players who dealt damage to the target. And lastly, Suppress will last for 5 seconds against players and for 7 seconds against PvE combatants. There are only 2 non-super abilities in the game today that suppress, and those suppression effects last for a whopping 10 seconds. In an environment where suppression is more widely available, the suppress duration needs to come down for this effect to not ruin PvP and to not completely trivialize PvE. And lastly, let's talk about the Consume effect. The consume effect would be triggered either by defeating a suppressed target or by some void abilities directly. The consume effect is not an AoE effect and is instead a player buff. While the consume effect is active, the player will have faster grenade, melee, and class ability cooldowns. Think of consume as feeding the void and being rewarded by the void with a surge of ability energy. The consume effect would last for 3 seconds by default. And with all of these changes to void as an element, I think that it would be on par with stasis, both in terms of unique effects as well as possessing an individual identity of enter the void. Now, let's dive into Void Titans and redesign them to have fully customizable subclasses. With Void as an element itself revamped, we can now discuss how Titan, Hunter, and Warlock Void subclasses can be redesigned with customizable aspects and fragments. We're going to start this discussion with Void Titans. In the game today, Void Titans do have some customization options, being able to select either Towering or Rally Barricade, a choice between High, Strafe, and Catapult Lift, and then your pick of Magnetic, Void Wall, or Suppressor Grenades. The problem then comes with the 3 subclass trees. These trees are clusters of 4 perks that are bound to each other, and you only have the choice of one of the 3 trees. In contrast, Stasis Titan lets you choose your Barricade, Lift, and Grenade, and then gives you the choice of which aspects to run, as well as which fragments to accompany them. We need to decouple the Light Subclass trees and recategorize the perks within them into aspects, fragments, super abilities, and melee abilities. And the crazy thing is, that process is actually pretty simple, as within the vast majority of Light Subclass trees, there is typically 1 perk that alters the behavior of the super, 1 perk that alters the behavior of the melee, and then 2 perks that grant new abilities in a similar fashion to these stasis aspects. The only things missing are fragments unique to each light element, be it void, solar, or arc. To remedy this, I've designed 8 new void fragments that could be used for Void Titans, Hunters, and Warlocks, similar to how stasis fragments are ubiquitous across the 3 stasis subclasses. With all of these details in mind, let's walk through what an updated Titan Void subclass screen would look like. First off, you'd be presented with a choice of 3 different super options: Ward of Dawn, Banner Shield, and Second Shield. After selecting your super attunement, you'd then have your choice of Barricade as well as your Jump. Then, you'd have a choice between 3 different melee options. You'd have Shield Bash, which would suppress targets on impact, or you could choose Defensive Strike, which would be updated to trigger the consume effect when you defeat a target, and your last choice would be Tactical Strike, which would be updated to negate targets damaged by its Void Blast. For your grenades, you'd again have 3 different options. You'd have Suppressor Grenades, which would suppress all affected targets, or you could choose Void Wall Grenades, which would be updated to cause targets to become negated upon impact. Perhaps you instead favor the Magnetic Grenade, which would be updated to trigger the consume effect when this grenade kills a target. Now, here's where the fun begins. For your aspects, you'd have 2 slots and 6 different options to choose from. You'd have In the Trenches, which would come with 2 fragment slots, as while a faster super cooldown is powerful, you'd have to put yourself in harm's way near groups of enemies to get any benefit. There would also be Superior Arsenal, which would also come with 2 fragment slots. Another aspect would be Rallying Force, which would come with just 1 fragment slot, as health for both yourself and nearby allies for any melee kill, powered or not, is a very potent effect. The next aspect option would be Turn the Tide, which would come with 3 fragment slots. as you would be pigeonholed into using the defensive strike melee ability to get any use out of this aspect. You could also choose Controlled Demolition, which would come with just one fragment slot, as this aspect adds additional Void AoE damage to all your Void abilities, which is a very powerful perk. And finally, the last aspect option would be Resupply, which would be updated to grant health, melee energy, and grenade energy from both your Void detonators exploding and when your Void grenades themselves damage a target. This way, if you aren't using the aspect Controlled Demolition, you are still getting some effect from the resupply aspect. This final aspect would come with just one fragment slot, however, as refunded health, melee energy, and grenade energy is a very strong effect. And now, let's discuss the Void Fragments. I've designed 8 Void Fragments from which you'd be able to choose from. The first of these fragments would be Call of the Defender, which would give a bonus to weapon reload speed after damaging a target with your Void abilities, and would grant a bonus 10 mobility. This fragment was inspired by the old perk War Machine from the Defender subclass in Destiny 1. Next up would be Call of the Unknown, where defeating negated or suppressed targets grants you class ability energy. This fragment would be the Void version of the Stasis fragment, Whisper of Refraction. The third Void fragment would be Call of the Negator, and it would make negate from your abilities last longer, increase the duration of abilities that linger, and would incur a penalty of -10 recovery. This fragment would be the Void version of the Stasis fragment, Whisper of Durance. The fourth Void fragment would be Call of the Hunger, where the consume effect lasts longer and now grants a small health bump when procced, and it would grant a bonus +10 resilience. This fragment was inspired by the old perk The Hunger from the Voidwalker subclass in Destiny 1. The fifth Void fragment would be Call of the Cosmos, where your recovery speed and outgoing Void damage are increased when you are near negated or suppressed targets. This fragment would be the Void version of the Stasis fragment, Whisper of Chains, but with a focus on amping up your Void damage. The sixth Void fragment would be Call of the Night, where defeating suppressed targets grants you super energy, and would incur penalties of -10 intellect and -10 strength. This fragment would be the Void version of the Stasis fragment, Whisper of Bonds. The seventh Void fragment would be Call of the Vacuum, which would grant nearby allies a faster grenade cooldown while the consume effect is active. This fragment would be the Void subclass version of the exotic perk Death Throes found on Verity's brow. And finally, the eighth Void fragment would be Call of the Suppressor, which would increase the blast radius of suppressing Void abilities, and when you defeat negated targets. This fragment would be the Void version of the Stasis fragment, Whisper of Fissures, just without the extra damage. And with all these new fragments and the freeing of melee, super, and aspect level perks from our current locked subclass trees, there would be a ton of new builds available as a Void Titan. Let me walk you through a potential new build under this system. Say you wanted to go all in on the Call of the Suppressor fragment and create a light-based crowd control setup. You could trick yourself out with suppressor grenades and the shield bash melee to suppress your enemies as much as possible. You could take this even further by utilizing a truth teller with blinding grenades, so you can keep enemies locked down even when your abilities are on cooldown. To get your abilities back even faster, you could equip the aspect Resupply, which would grant grenade energy and melee energy each time your suppressor grenade deals damage. Ability cooldown still too slow? Slap on the exotic sidearm Traveler's Chosen to generate ability energy extremely quickly, as you'll be able to mop up helpless enemies that are suppressed or blinded with your sidearm. Since you'll constantly be dishing out Void damage, you could throw on the fragment Call of the Defender to boost the reload speed of your weapons, which is especially useful with a single-shot grenade launcher. And since you're already going to be playing a support type of role, why not take advantage of Ward of Dawn to give your teammates easy orbs and bonus weapon damage? Considering how much ability energy you're going to be generating between Resupply, Traveler's Chosen, and the consume effect from defeating suppressed targets, I'd rock the exotic gauntlets, Doomfang Pauldrons, which give you a huge chunk of super energy on powered void melee kills. And why stop there? Take advantage of the fragment Call of the Night to manufacture even more super energy when you defeat suppressed enemies. You could then crank your super generation up to 11 with the aspect In the Trenches, considering that you'll be in the thick of combat, suppressing and blinding enemies all the time. And for the finishing touch, you could equip a set of combat mods to make this build even more powerful. Swift Charge would charge you with light each time you take out a group of suppressed enemies with your sidearm, and Stacks on Stacks would turn that into 2 charged with light stacks. Supercharged would then let you store 4 stacks of charged with light. All these stacks could then be used with the mod Surprise Attack to make your Traveler's Chosen into a Death Ray. And last but not least, Heavy Handed would refund half of your Shield Bash melee anytime you use it while charged with light, which would let you proc Doomfang Pauldrons even more often for even more supers. And this insane Void Suppression build is just one example of what would be possible as a Void Titan with updated subclass customization. Now, let's turn our eyes to redesigning Void Hunters with this aspect and fragment system. Now, let's take a look at what an updated Void Hunter subclass would look like. First off, you'd be presented with a choice of 3 different super options: Deadfall, Spectral Blades, and Mobius Quiver. After selecting your super attunement, you'd then have your choice of Dodge as well as your Jump. Then, you'd have a choice between 3 different melee options. You'd have Vanish and Smoke, which would be updated to trigger the Consume effect when this melee damages a target, or you could choose Snare Bomb, which would now suppress enemies on impact, and your last choice would be Corrosive Smoke, which would be updated to negate damaged targets. For your grenades, you'd again have 3 different options. This one, however, will be the one exception to my rule of each grenade option for a subclass procs a different elemental effect, as all 3 Night Stalker grenades in the game today are AoE grenades, 2 of which are shared with the other 2 Void subclasses. To this end, both Vortex and Void Wall grenades would negate targets, and the Spike grenade would suppress targets. I was unable to have one of these 3 grenades proc the Consume effect without causing issues with the Void Titan and Warlock subclasses. Sorry, Hunters. Unless Bungie wants to give Night Stalkers more grenade options, you'll just have one less tool in your belt to trigger the Consume effect. For your aspects, you'd have 2 slots and 6 different options to choose from. You'd have Lockdown, which would come with just 1 fragment slot, as doubling the duration of grenade effects is a very potent ability. There would also be Combat Provision, which would come with 2 fragment slots. Another aspect would be Vanishing Step, which would come with just 1 fragment slot, as the ability to go invisible with just a dodge, which itself has a very fast cooldown speed, is a very potent effect, especially in PvP. The next aspect option would be Keen Scout, which would come with 2 fragment slots. You could also choose Flawless Execution, which would come with just 1 fragment slot, as the ability to proc invisibility and temporary wall hacks from simple precision kills is both very powerful and something that has no cooldown associated with it. And finally, the last aspect option would be Shattering Strike, which would be updated to cause your melee attacks to negate enemies after becoming invisible from any source, not just from Flawless Execution, and it would come with 2 fragment slots. With your aspects selected, you'd then be able to choose from the same 8 void fragments that we discussed earlier in the video. As for a new, unique build, say you wanted to become a true assassin that strikes from the shadows and returns to them at a moment's notice. You could choose Vanishing Step, Flawless Execution, and Vanish and Smoke to have 3 different ways to become invisible. You could then equip Gambler's Dodge to be able to get your invis smoke back more often as you slip by unsuspecting enemies. You could even extend the duration of all your invisibility effects with the exotic helmet Graviton Forfeit, which also drastically speeds up the cooldown of your melee ability while you're invisible, meaning even more invis smoke bombs. With all these options for stealth, you could then focus on maximizing your lethality. A great way to do this would be with negating abilities to make your enemies take additional damage. You could equip the fragment Call of the Negator to keep your enemies vulnerable even longer. Throw on vortex grenades as your primary way to negate your foes. You could also equip the fragment Call of the Unknown to generate dodge energy when you defeat negated targets, letting you take advantage of Vanishing Step even more often. As for your super, I'd rock Deadfall to ensnare large groups of enemies and deal massive shared damage amongst them. As for your weapons, there isn't a better weapon in the game for safe, consistent damage than Anarchy, which will continue to fry your enemies even after you've disappeared back into the shadows. And to take full advantage of flawless execution, there isn't a better precision primary weapon to use than a bow like Imperial Needle, which can roll with perks like Sneak Bow to keep you off radar and undetected while you're crouched, as well as Wellspring to generate ability energy. And I mean, come on, if Skyrim taught us anything, it's just how OP stealth archers are. Anyways, keeping up with your identity as a stealth assassin, you could also rock a potent sniper like Succession, which can roll with Vorpal Weapon to deal even more damage to high-tier enemies. And last but not least, you could equip a set of combat mods to become an even more dangerous hunter of the night. Precision Charge will grant you stacks of Charged with Light for rapidly defeating enemies with your bow, with stacks on stacks doubling those gains. High Energy Fire will let you deal even more damage to your enemies. Finally, you could take advantage of Elemental Well mods like Elemental Armaments, which will generate wells due to Imperial Needle being a void weapon that matches your subclass. And to cap things off, the mod Font of Wisdom would drastically decrease the cooldown of your super each time you pick up an Elemental Well. A build like this, focused on stalking your enemies from the shadows and then dishing out massive amounts of damage before retreating back into the night, would be very fun and would also be one of the best solo PvE builds in the game. Now, let's turn our eyes to redesigning Void Warlocks with this aspect and fragment system. Now, let's take a look at what an updated Void Warlock subclass would look like. First off, you'd be presented with a choice of 3 different super options: Cataclysm, Nova Warp, and Vortex, which would now negate targets caught in the post-explosion singularity. After selecting your super attunement, you'd then have your choice of Rift, as well as your choice of Jump. Then, you'd have a choice between 3 different melee options. You'd have Devour, which would now trigger the Consume effect upon kills with this melee ability, or you could choose Entropic Pull, which would be updated to negate targets on impact, and your last choice would be Atomic Breach, which would cause a suppressing blast of void energy. For your grenades, you'd again have 3 different options. You'd have Axion Bolts, which would be updated to trigger the Consume effect upon damaging a target, or you could choose Vortex Grenades, which would be updated to negate targets damaged by the grenade, or perhaps you instead favor the Scatter Grenade, which would be updated to suppress any targets caught in its blasts. For your aspects, you'd have 2 slots and 6 different options to choose from. You'd have Feed the Void, which would come with only 1 fragment slot, as full health regen, the Devour effect, and the Consume effect is one of the strongest perks in the game. There would also be Insatiable, which would come with 2 fragment slots, as while extending the Devour effect and granting grenade energy on each kill is extremely strong, this aspect locks you into using either the Devour melee or the Feed the Void aspect to get get any benefit. Another aspect would be Bloom, which would come with 2 fragment slots. The next aspect option would be Chaos Accelerant, which would come with just 1 fragment slot, as the ability to supercharge your grenades is extremely potent. You could also choose Handheld Supernova, which would come with just 1 fragment slot, as a one-hit kill ability is one of the most powerful options you can have in a Crucible match. And finally, the last aspect option would be Dark Matter, which would come with 2 fragment slots. With your aspects selected, you would then be able to choose from the same 8 Void fragments that we discussed earlier in the video. As for a new unique build that would be possible for Void Warlocks under this new system, I think that going all in on the Call of the Cosmos fragment to increase your outgoing Void damage would be extremely enticing. You could slap on Atomic Breach and scatter grenades to fill the battlefield with suppressing Void Blasts, which would in turn amp up all your Void damage sources. You could then also take full advantage of Slova Bomb to deal literal nuclear amounts of boosted damage. Throw on the Bloom aspect to generate additional Void explosions that are also amped up by the Call of the Cosmos fragment. You could also run the Dark Matter aspect to get health and ability energy back from all your Void ability kills. And don't forget, since Atomic Breach and Scatter Grenades suppress targets, you will constantly trigger the consume effect when you defeat those suppressed enemies. You could also equip the fragments Call of the Hunger and Call of the Vacuum to maximize the benefits of the consume effect. And why stop there? Throw on the exotic helmet Nezarec Sin to speed up the cooldown of your abilities even further. And since Nezarec Sin is procced from all Void kills, ability, or weapon, why not equip some of the best Void weapons in the game, such as Graviton Lance and Royal Entry. Since you'll be chucking Void abilities left and right, why not rock the Call of the Defender fragment to reload your weapons much faster? And finally, you could equip a set of combat mods to cement your reign as King of the Void. Elemental Ordnance will spawn elemental wells from grenade takedowns, and when you pick up those wells, the damage of your Void weapons will be increased, and you will also acquire 2 stacks of Charged with Light. And you could then throw on 2 copies of the mod Firepower to refund grenade energy anytime you use a grenade while charged with Light. The synergies possible with an updated Void Warlock subclass are simply endless. And just like that, we've come to the end of another video. Hopefully you guys all enjoyed this latest installment and how we can continue to evolve Destiny 2. It's been a lot of work these past few weeks, but I'm extremely happy with how these subclass revamp videos ended up. We can only hope that Bungie draws some inspiration from our proposed reworks when they eventually get around to updating the light-based subclasses. Next week, I'm thinking that the time will finally be right to take a deep dive into the general Crucible experience and discuss what a renewed focus on PvP should actually look like. Thank you guys so much for the ongoing support. We absolutely smashed through 30,000 subs last weekend and are already on the march towards 40,000 subs. And finally, before we part ways, I wanted to let you all know that I am now officially partnered with Advanced GG, makers of some of the best gaming supplements on the market today. I've left a link in the description if you are interested in checking them out. And with all that said, that's going to be it from me this week. As always, if you want to support this channel, make sure to leave a comment down below, drop a like, and hit that sub button. Have a wonderful week, guys, and I hope to catch you all in the next one. This has been your host, Kujay. Cheers.